All right, so this is a course about power, morality, and international relations. So it's appropriate that we start off by talking about power. So what is power? Power is the ability to alter the behavior of others to get what you want. If you can stop someone from doing what they want, get someone to do something that you want, or make people believe that they want to do something, then you have power. What are some of the different kinds of power? Well, I would say there are 3 or maybe 3.5 ways to exercise power. Coercion, sticks, payments, the carrots, and soft power, or the power of attraction. And the half power is legitimacy, which might be viewed as a kind of soft power, or it might be its own thing, depending on how you look at it. So I think hard power is fairly easy to understand. Carrots and sticks, right? Threats and bribes. To get someone to do something you want them to do, you can either try to bribe them by giving them rewards, or you can threaten them by threatening punishments if they don't. But soft power, I think, is less well understood, so I'm going to focus a little bit on soft power. Soft power is also called the power of attraction. What does that mean? Well, it means that the fact that people like you and want to emulate you means they will do things for you, even if you don't offer rewards or threaten penalties. It makes your life easier because they are much more willing to go along with whatever you're doing when you have soft power than when you don't. Think a little bit of how celebrities in this world get free meals all over town. Everybody wants to have them in their restaurant or in their nightclub, and so as a result, they get free meals. Now, they haven't given any threats. They haven't offered any rewards, really, except perhaps, I guess, their presence. But people just want to make them happy. They want to do things for them. They get a lot of free stuff in the mail. They get a lot of solicitations more generally. And a lot of that is due to the fact that they have soft power. Where does a soft power come from? Well, I think a country's soft power can come from many sources. It can come from its culture, it can come from its political values, it can come from its foreign policies, it can come from its economy. There are a lot of things about countries that other countries or other people would like to emulate. Now, a strong economy can be a source of both hard and soft power. The economy is hard power when states use the strength of their economies to either reward allies or punish enemies. So, for instance, when the United States threatens to stop trading with a country, that can be very, very bad for that country, and that can count as a threat. When the United States offers to increase tariffs on certain countries, those are taxes on imports, right? When it offers to increase taxes on imports, that is a kind of threat. And when it offers to lower taxes on imports, that is to say tariffs, or offer a country's most favored nation status. Most favored nation status is a status that countries can acquire where that country gets the lowest tariffs on their goods that the country offers to anyone. So, a country will have many different deals with many different countries, and most favored trading nation status is when a country guarantees another country that they will get the lowest tariffs no matter what they are. Okay, a strong economy can be soft power, though, when your economy or its rules or its business practices or its companies attract emulators because of their performance. When you have a very strong economy, that creates a lot of admiration among other countries. How can we be like the United States? Or how, more recently, perhaps, how can we be like China? In the 1980s, it was how can we be like Japan? Again, these things attract emulators, and just like celebrities, countries with strong economies have a certain amount of soft power. People will do things for them. It makes it easier for them to get cooperation on the issues that they care about, and all of that counts as soft power. So here's an example not of an increase in soft power, but a decrease in soft power. The financial crisis of 2008 really weakens the soft power of the American economy quite considerably. Since the 1950s, policymakers and the business community have looked to America as an example of how to create wealth. The American economy has been incredibly strong for a very, very long time. And I say since the 1950s, but in reality, it might have been long before that. It might well be since the 1890s. But at least since the 1950s, a lot of policymakers have looked to the United States as an example for how to create wealth. But nowadays, many people, particularly since 2008, look to the United States as a cautionary tale of what not to do. They really want to avoid American levels of debt, American levels of risk-taking in the economy, particularly in the financial sector, and American levels of unsustainable consumer consumption. So all of these things are things that have used to be perceived perhaps as good. So American risk-taking used to be thought of as, well, that's a dynamic economy. And sure, lots of businesses fail, but lots of innovation, good things happen because of American risk-taking. And Americans take on a lot of debt, but that's a good thing because Americans are creating wealth for tomorrow and the technologies of tomorrow that will diffuse throughout the world. And so those things used to be perceived of as good, and now they're perceived of as bad or dangerous. And as a result, people don't want to emulate them anymore. Now, this has had consequences for American ability to get its way in the world. And indeed, there's already some evidence trickling in that it's harder for the United States to get its way on trade negotiations, for example, because people no longer are believing that whatever the United States says or does is the right thing to do or is the most attractive thing to do. Now, one could ask, is soft power better or worse than hard power? At some level, I think it's easy to look at soft power and say, well, it's not as direct, it's not as clearly authoritative, it doesn't involve explicit commands usually, so perhaps soft power is worse in some ways than hard power. It's easier to just be able to tell people what to do and be able to threaten them credibly. On the other hand, you might also think of soft power as being better in some ways, right? Soft power in some ways is less coercive. It doesn't force people to do anything they don't want to do. In fact, it relies on people actually wanting to do what you want them to do. So in that sense, having soft power and being able to wield soft power is a way of doing things without ruffling too many feathers, right? Without making people upset. And of course, that's perhaps better in some sense. Now, I don't think that it's better or worse. This is just a different kind of power. It's not necessarily better to twist minds than to twist arms, and in a lot of situations you can accomplish the same thing using soft and hard power. If I want to steal your money, for example, I can threaten you with a gun, that's the stick, or I can swindle you with a get-rich-quick scheme, which is a kind of way of offering you a false reward. But I can also make it seem very attractive and morally right to hand over your estate to my church as part of a spiritual journey. And particularly if others around you are doing it, donating your money to a church or a government that I control will seem normal. It will seem appropriate. It will seem like the right thing to do. In other words, I will have soft power. What about the military, right? It's often thought the military is a source of hard power. It's the quintessential stick. It's the quintessential threat. Well, I don't think it's that obvious. I think that the military can wield a fair amount of soft power as well. A very well-run military can be a source of admiration. One example might be the very impressive job that the United States military did in providing humanitarian relief after the tsunami that hit the Indian Ocean and the earthquakes that hit South Asia in 2005. All of those things helped boost the reputation for effectiveness and for moral righteousness of the U.S. military. So when the military does good things for just causes, the United States gains prestige around the world, which makes it easier for the United States militarily to get cooperation on missions, right? People look at the U.S. military coming to town and they think these are the good guys, right? But of course, that's not the only way things could go down. When the world perceives that the U.S. military is fighting the wrong war for the wrong reasons, and when it does so in an apparently brutal or inhumane way, America's soft power will decline. This was probably true, at certain times in the 1950s, for example. So America's soft power goes up and down based on the perception of its military, both its technical proficiency, but also the um, causes or reasons for which it's deployed. And so when America's soft power declines, then countries around the world are less likely to follow American leadership because it's attractive. They're more likely to think that it might not be a good thing and are more likely to oppose what the United States government wants to do. Let me talk a little bit about that third and a half power, this legitimacy. Um, Legitimacy is the power to make people obey you because they think they ought to, rather than because of any threat or sanction, right? So if I have legitimacy, then it's the case that people around me think that they should obey me because of the fact that I have legitimacy, because they think they ought to, right? So in some sense, parents have a kind of legitimacy, or authority would be another word. In international relations, we use the term legitimacy typically. Whereas soft power functions a lot like leadership by example, right? People want to emulate you because they like what you do, and they want to do things for you because they admire you. Legitimacy involves usually someone issuing rules, right? Whereas soft power doesn't involve anyone issuing rules. And it involves people obeying not because it's in their self-interest, but because they think they ought to, right? So legitimacy is a little bit more moralized than soft power. People don't do things for celebrities because they think they ought to do things for celebrities. They do things for celebrities because they want to. Whereas, legitimacy usually has this higher moralized component. You do things, you obey legitimate authorities because you think you ought to. So legitimacy is typically a property of institutions, right? It's a property of international institutions or domestic institutions, not a property of individual countries. So the United Nations might sometimes, or at least on some issues, have legitimacy. People will do what the UN says, will follow Security Council resolutions, will follow United States General Assembly resolutions, because they think that they carry some amount of legitimacy. Another example might be a climate conference, right? If a climate conference recommends a certain level of reduction in CO2 emissions, then those recommendations might carry legitimacy. A certain number of countries, perhaps many countries, might take that to heart and say, well, that's what we ought to do, and that will provide the starting point or the base point for negotiations about reductions in carbon dioxide emissions. Now, in neither case is it the case that anyone wants to do things for them or cooperate with them or emulate them because they want to be like them, right? Nobody wants to be like the UN. Nobody wants to be a climate change conference, right? But countries will go along with their recommendations because they feel that those recommendations are appropriate and carry legitimacy. Let's talk a little bit about this issue of decaying power that Naim brings up in his readings. So there are two really distinct and coextensive phenomena that Naim is documenting here, right? On the one hand, power is spreading. More and more actors have access to power. On the other hand, power is decaying. What that means is that what you can do with power once you get it is less than before. It used to be that power could give you lots and lots of options, and now it gives you fewer. What are some evidence for these claims? Well, he notes the weaker side in warfare more often achieves its objectives of late, right? So having a powerful military isn't what it used to be. Technologies of warfare are easier to purchase and use, right? So smaller, even non-state actors have access to fairly destructive technologies that they can deploy against larger, more powerful militaries. There are fewer and fewer autocracies in the world. It just doesn't seem to be the case that people want to have lots of power anymore. Power seems to be dispersing within countries. In the economy, CEOs are less likely to keep their jobs than ever. It used to be that being a CEO involved some job security. Now there's much less job security at the CEO level, even as pay has gone up. And I don't think those two things are unrelated, actually. High earners are much more vulnerable to market fluctuations now. So it used to be the case that, if you made a lot of money in year 1, you'd probably also be making a lot of money in year 5, year 10, and year 15. But nowadays, it seems that there's more fluctuation in earnings, both upwards and downwards. More and more political parties are appearing in the political scene of many countries. The United States is a bit atypical there, where we still have, for the most part, two parties. But in other countries, we see the appearance of more and more political parties. Traditional political parties just aren't able to garner as much of the electorate or as much electoral support as they used to. Fortune 500 companies are less and less likely to stay in the Fortune 500, right? So it used to be the case that if you were already rich, that was a good predictor of being rich in the future. That just doesn't seem to be the case. It seems to be the case that newer companies are displacing older companies at a faster rate than in prior eras. Brands are more vulnerable to bad press. Right, so it just doesn't seem to be the case that people trust brands as much as they used to, and when a company is involved in a scandal, that can really hurt the company a lot more than it used to. And finally, religions. Dominant religions do not seem to be as dominant anymore. It seems to be the case that a lot of start-up religions, so to speak, a lot of smaller, Naeem mentions Pentecostalist religions, seem to be doing a lot better than the larger dominating religions. And so it seems to me that religious belief is fragmenting in a variety of ways. And so all of that adds up to a case for power being more spread out than it used to be, and not being quite as valuable as it used to be and worth seeking. So what are some of the reasons underlying this? Well, it's complicated, and I don't know that I want to go too much into depth here, but technology seems to be one main reason, right? So it seems that technology makes it easier to hold people accountable in a variety of ways, right? Things like Yelp reviews didn't exist 10 years ago. And what that means is that businesses have a harder time swindling their customers. Governments have a harder time hiding and covering up mistakes. Politicians have a much harder time covering up affairs that they might be having, and so on and so forth. Information advantages are lower. It used to be the case that it would be possible to hold large informational advantages over others and exploit those informational advantages. And by that I mean, people who are experts in the stock market, for instance, or well connected, might be able to, even without any insider trading, exploit their information advantage over the average investor. It might be the case that patents and technology is easier now to reverse. It's easier to figure out what people have done than before, and so that makes it harder to sustain an advantage based on, say, being the first mover in a market, the first person to market a product. Used to perhaps enjoy a 3, 4, 5 year advantage until companies caught up, but now maybe it's a 1 to 2 year or maybe even a 6-month advantage, as perhaps a Chinese or an Indian company is able to copy what they're doing very, very quickly. So again, information advantages are going to be lower, wealth advantages are lesser. It used to be that wealth bought you more power. Again, this is going to be controversial, and of course it's going to be different in different contexts or over the world, but Naeem is trying to make the case here that wealth advantages just don't buy you quite as much security, particularly, as it used to. And also related to technology, but somewhat distinct, is globalization. The cost of not trading with other countries, the cost of not having access to markets, is higher than ever before. That is to say that if you're a company or you're working for a company that sells a product, not having access to world markets is just more costly than before. And there's also a more intense competition for capital between companies. Companies can no longer afford to be particularly inefficient. The lowering of barriers, particularly to capital movements, means that if you're not performing, money can go, investment capital can go somewhere else very, very quickly, and all over the world, not just throughout your country, but all over the world. And it's harder to keep cartels going. This more intense competitive environment means that it's much harder for producers to gang up together to raise prices on consumers. I'll give you an example from my own research in natural resources. In the 1960s and even in the 1970s, there were many international cartels. cocoa and coffee and palm oil and a number of international commodities were subject to producer cartels. That means that countries like Ghana and the Ivory Coast and Congo and other major exporters, say of coffee and cocoa, would get together and would try to set prices by limiting the quantity of cocoa or coffee that would hit the world market. What this did, in theory, was increase the prices for consumers, but it also enabled producers to get more revenue from their cocoa and their coffee than they might otherwise in a competitive environment where they were in a bidding war with one another. These cartels are fairly unstable because, of course, anybody who doesn't belong to the cartel will try to sell as much as they can for below the cartel price. And that will tend to put pressure on cartel members to then start selling more, and then the price collapses. And indeed, that's what happened. The prices of coffee and cocoa did collapse multiple times during the 60s and 70s. It's a story for another day, but the point is that it's harder for cartels to keep going. Today, we only really have one major international cartel, which is OPEC, the cartel of oil-producing countries, but OPEC itself seems to be weaker than before. OPEC does not seem to have the control over its members, and that's in part because more and more countries are producing oil all over the world. It used to be that only a few countries did. Now many countries do, and so it's much harder to discipline cartel members. So, in conclusion, what should we think about these developments? How should we think about the decay of power, the spread of power, soft power? Well, the way I would look at it is that the same thing that has lowered the fraction of the world population living in abject poverty is the thing that makes it harder to address global issues, like, for instance, global climate change. And that's because cooperation is harder than ever before because global leaders like the United States have fewer means to get things done. They have less power. Even in 1989, when the agreement on what are they called? Fluorocarbons, right? The ozone layer treaty. And the treaty that would try to reduce the gases that we're eating into the ozone layer was quite successful. And this was passed in 1989, largely because the United States was able to lead most countries through that process. Fast forward to the 1997 Kyoto Protocol or more recent attempts to reach agreements on global climate change and emissions. And you see much less success, in part because the United States just has less power than it once did to force other people to arrive at a common solution. The common solution might not be the best solution for everyone. It's probably the one the United States prefers, but it certainly would have helped address the problem, and we're just not getting that sort of agreement anymore. So it's harder and harder for leaders to marshal the cooperation necessary to get big projects done, particularly at the global level. On the other hand, increased competition and better access to technology and all of the associated features of this spreading and decay of power has meant that governments and private companies have a much harder time making themselves better off at the expense of their clients and citizens. That is to say that if governments and private companies want to thrive, they have to serve rather than coerce. And that's not always been the case. Again, these are macro trends. Individual cases will vary. In some cases, you'll see things moving in the other direction. But I think Naeem is probably correct to say that on the whole, over the last, say, 50 years or so, this is probably true. Populations in the developing world are better off than they ever have been before, largely because of this fragmentation of power and the fact that they now have access to developed world markets and they have access to technology that is spreading faster and faster than ever before. But at the same time, this makes it harder to get major areas of cooperation or successfully cooperate in large-scale situations where we have large-scale problems. So It's a bit of a mixed blessing.